Joseph's name was known in every corner of town. At 35 years old, he was a beacon of strength, vitality, and energy. His gym, Suck It Up, wasn't just a place to lift weights or run on treadmills. It was a community, a second home for many. Men admired him, women adored him, and kids whispered his name as if he were a superhero. Joseph's charm, however, didn't win everyone over. Many men in town envied him, calling him arrogant behind his back. But Joseph never cared much for what people thought. He had grown up with thick skin, raised by his single mom Anna, who always reminded him to stay focused and kind no matter what life threw his way. The gym was Joseph's pride and joy. Every day was the same. Morning clients lifting weights, the sound of upbeat music, and a lot of sweat and determination. But things took an unusual turn the day Ruth walked through the doors of Suck It Up. Ruth wasn't like the other women Joseph was used to seeing at the gym. At 60, she carried herself with grace and an air of quiet confidence. She wasn't shy about her age, but her youthful appearance often fooled people. With neatly tied auburn hair, bright hazel eyes, and a radiant smile, Ruth didn't look like she belonged in a fitness center. Yet there she was, signing up for a membership with determination in her voice. "I'll take the full package," Ruth had said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She handed over her credit card without hesitation, her gaze firm. Joseph glanced at her skeptically. He had seen plenty of people sign up for the gym, only to quit a week later. Ruth seemed like another one of them. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's not easy, you know. Most people don't stick with it." Ruth smiled knowingly. "I didn't come here for easy. I came here for results. See you tomorrow, Joseph." And just like that, Ruth became a regular at Suck It Up. At first, Joseph barely noticed her. His attention was usually on younger clients who needed constant motivation or advice. But Ruth didn't ask for help. She quietly followed the workout routines, pushed herself harder than some of the younger members, and never complained. Weeks turned into months, and Ruth was still there, showing up every morning like clockwork. One day, as Joseph wiped down a bench press, he couldn't help but notice Ruth deadlifting a heavy barbell in the corner. She grunted softly as she lifted, her determination written all over her face. Surprised, Joseph walked over. "Hey, you're pretty strong for someone who, well..." He hesitated, realizing how rude he might sound. "For someone my age?" Ruth finished for him, chuckling. "I'll take that as a compliment, Joseph." He smiled awkwardly. "You've been coming here for months now. Most people don't last this long. What's your secret?" "No secret," Ruth said, setting the barbell down and catching her breath. "I just don't quit." Joseph couldn't help but be impressed. He decided to keep an eye on her workouts after that, occasionally offering tips and encouragement. Slowly, their interactions became more frequent. One morning, while Ruth was doing squats, Joseph approached her. "So, what made you start working out?" he asked, curious. Ruth paused mid-squat, thinking for a moment. "Let's just say I needed a change," she said softly. "Sometimes when life takes things away from you, you have to find something to fill the void." Joseph nodded, sensing there was more to her story than she was letting on. But he didn't push. He respected her privacy, even as his curiosity about her grew. Over time, Joseph and Ruth began talking more. She told him little bits about her life, how she had been married to a wonderful man who passed away years ago, how they had tried and failed to have children, and how she often felt lonely despite her wealth. Joseph shared stories of his childhood, how his mother raised him alone, and how he started the gym from nothing. Their conversations weren't always serious. Ruth had a sharp sense of humor that often caught Joseph off guard, and he found himself laughing more than he had in years. One day, as they chatted by the water cooler, Joseph said, "You know, Ruth, you're not like anyone I've ever met." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "A good thing," Joseph replied quickly. "Most people come here to show off or because they feel like they have to. But you're different. You're here for you." Ruth smiled, her hazel eyes twinkling. "I guess that makes two of us. You're not like anyone I've met either." Their connection, though subtle at first, was undeniable. Ruth's quiet strength and Joseph's lively energy balanced each other out in a way neither of them had expected. Joseph had always prided himself on being a good judge of people. He could tell within moments of meeting someone whether they'd stick around in his gym or fade away. But Ruth had surprised him. She wasn't just another client, and over time she became something more. A friend. It started with small conversations. After Ruth's workouts, Joseph would join her at the smoothie bar in the corner of Suck It Up. She always ordered the same thing, a green smoothie with extra spinach, while Joseph preferred his protein-packed chocolate shake. "So Joseph," Ruth asked one day, taking a sip of her drink, "what made you open a gym?" Joseph leaned back in his chair, thinking. "Growing up, it was just me and my mom. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to keep food on the table. I was this scrawny kid who got picked on a lot. One day, I decided I didn't want to feel weak anymore, so I started working out." He paused, smiling at the memory. "I didn't have much, just a couple of old dumbbells I found at a garage sale. But it was enough. Working out gave me confidence. It made me feel like I could take on the world. So, when I got older, I wanted to give that same feeling to other people." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "That's a beautiful story. Your mom must be so proud of you." "She is," Joseph said, his voice softening. "She's my biggest supporter. She still stops by the gym sometimes, even though she doesn't work out. Just to say hi." Ruth smiled. "She sounds like an incredible woman. I'd love to meet her someday." Their conversations grew longer and deeper with each passing week. Ruth began opening up about her own life, sharing things she hadn't told anyone in years. "My husband Jason was the love of my life," she confided one day. "We were married for over 30 years. He was kind, patient, and everything I could have ever wanted in a partner. But," she hesitated, her voice trembling slightly, "we never had children. We tried, but it just wasn't meant to be. After he passed, the house felt so empty. That's why I started coming here, to keep my mind busy." Joseph listened intently, his heart aching for her. "I'm sorry, Ruth. That must have been hard." "It still is," Ruth admitted. "But being here talking to you, it helps." Joseph didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability, but he appreciated Ruth's honesty. It made him respect her even more. As the weeks turned into months, their friendship deepened. Ruth became a fixture at Suck It Up, not just for her workouts but for her conversations with Joseph. They started texting outside of the gym, sharing jokes and updates about their day. One evening, Ruth invited Joseph over for dinner. "It's the least I can do after all the time you've spent helping me," she said. Joseph hesitated at first. He wasn't used to spending time with clients outside of the gym, but Ruth wasn't just a client anymore. She was a friend. When he arrived at her house, Joseph was taken aback. Ruth's home was elegant but cozy, filled with warm colors and personal touches. Family photos lined the walls, and the smell of homemade dishes filled the air. "Wow," Joseph said, looking around. "This place is amazing." "Thank you," Ruth replied, smiling. "It's a bit too big for just me, but it's home." Over dinner they talked and laughed like old friends. Ruth told stories about her travels with Jason, and Joseph shared embarrassing tales from his early days as a gym owner. "Wait, so you dropped an entire dumbbell rack on your foot?" Ruth asked, laughing so hard she had to put down her fork. Joseph groaned, rubbing his forehead. "Don't remind me. I couldn't walk properly for weeks. My mom kept saying, 'You're supposed to be strong, Joseph.'" After that night, their friendship grew even stronger. Joseph began visiting Ruth more often, sometimes just to check in, other times to help her with small things around the house. But as their bond deepened, Joseph couldn't help but notice something else. There was a loneliness in Ruth that no amount of laughter or conversation could fully erase. One afternoon, as they sat in Ruth's garden sipping tea, Joseph finally asked, "Do you ever think about, starting over? Finding someone new?" Ruth looked at him, surprised. "At my age? Joseph, I'm 60 years old. Who would want to be with me?" Joseph frowned. "Age doesn't matter. You're an incredible person, Ruth. Anyone would be lucky to have you." Ruth smiled sadly. "That's kind of you to say, but the world doesn't see it that way. People expect women my age to fade into the background, not start new chapters." "Well, maybe the world is wrong," Joseph said firmly. For a moment their eyes met and Ruth felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years. But she quickly pushed the thought aside. Joseph was her friend, nothing more. It started as a day like any other. Ruth had just finished a grueling workout at Suck It Up, her usual persistence shining through even when her muscles protested. But as she was about to leave, she felt a sharp wave of dizziness. Gripping the edge of the counter near the smoothie bar, she tried to steady herself. Joseph, who had been chatting with another client, noticed immediately. "Ruth, are you okay?" he asked, rushing to her side. "I'm fine," she murmured, brushing him off. But Joseph wasn't convinced. "You don't look fine," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Sit down. I'll get you some water." Ruth reluctantly sank into a chair, her breathing uneven. Joseph returned moments later with a bottle of water and crouched beside her. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," he said gently. "You need to rest." Ruth tried to protest, but the truth was she hadn't been feeling well for days. Between her rigorous gym sessions and sleepless nights spent thinking about the emptiness of her life, her body was finally giving out. "I'll drive you home," Joseph insisted, taking her gym bag. "No, you don't have to." "Ruth," he interrupted, his tone firm but kind, "I'm not letting you go home alone like this. Come on." Too tired to argue, Ruth allowed him to help her to his car. The drive to her house was quiet, the usual light-hearted banter between them replaced by an unspoken tension. When they arrived, Joseph helped Ruth inside and insisted she lie down. "Do you have any soup or something light to eat?" he asked, heading toward her kitchen. "There's some chicken soup in the store," Ruth called weakly from the couch. Joseph found the soup, heated it up and brought it to her with a glass of water. Sitting across from her, he watched as she sipped the liquid slowly. "You didn't have to do all this," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I did," Joseph replied. "You're my friend. And friends look out for each other." Something in his tone made Ruth's chest tighten. She wasn't used to people taking care of her. For years she had been the one to handle everything, her own grief, her own loneliness. But now, as Joseph sat there, his eyes filled with genuine concern, she felt something shift inside her. Over the next few days, Joseph visited Ruth every evening after work. He brought her meals, helped her tidy up, and even convinced her to watch a few comedy movies to lift her spirits. Ruth protested at first, but deep down she was grateful. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone until Joseph showed up at her door. One evening, as they sat on her couch watching a movie, Ruth turned to Joseph and said, "You know, you remind me of Jayan." Joseph raised an eyebrow. "Your husband?" Ruth nodded. "He had the same way of making people feel safe. Like everything was going to be okay no matter how bad things got." Joseph didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being compared to anyone, let alone someone as important. "He must have been an amazing man," Joseph said finally. "He was," Ruth said softly. "And you're an amazing man too, Joseph. Don't ever doubt that." The room grew quiet, the only sound coming from the movie playing in the background. Joseph looked at Ruth, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the TV, and felt a strange pull in his chest. He had always admired her strength and resilience, but now, sitting so close to her, he realized there was something more. "Ruth," he began, his voice hesitant. Before he could finish, Ruth placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to say anything," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know this is unusual. And I don't want you to feel—" "Stop," Joseph said gently, cutting her off. "You're not unusual, Ruth. You're incredible. And I'm not just saying that because we're friends." Ruth's breath hitched. "Joseph, I'm 60 years old. You're 35. What would people think?" "I don't care what people think," Joseph said firmly. "You've taught me that life is about more than what others say. It's about what feels right." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, Joseph leaned in and Ruth didn't pull away. Their lips met, the kiss gentle yet filled with unspoken emotions. When they pulled back, Ruth looked at him with a mixture of wonder and fear. "What are we doing, Joseph?" "Something that feels right," he said simply. But as the days went on, Ruth struggled with doubts. She couldn't shake the fear of judgment, the whispers she knew would follow if anyone found out about their budding relationship. Joseph, however, was patient. He didn't push her, giving her the space she needed to process her feelings. Then one evening, after another long day at the gym, Joseph found himself at Ruth's doorstep again. This time there was no pretense of illness or movies. They sat in her living room talking late into the night. "I'm scared, Joseph," Ruth admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what this means. Of what people will say." "I know," Joseph said softly. "But I'm not scared. And I'll be here no matter what." Ruth looked at him, her heart aching with both fear and a growing sense of hope. For the first time in years she felt truly seen, not as a 60-year-old widow but as a woman deserving of love. As the night stretched on, their connection deepened, and Ruth realized that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to take a chance on happiness. For weeks, Ruth and Joseph kept their relationship a secret. It wasn't that they were ashamed, far from it. But the weight of societal judgment loomed over them like a dark cloud, and Ruth especially felt the strain. Every morning she'd walk in to suck it up as though nothing had changed. She was still Ruth, the dedicated gym-goer who could hold a plank longer than most 20-somethings. And Joseph was still her cheerful, attentive trainer. But beneath the surface, everything was different. They stole glances when no one was looking. A fleeting smile here, a brush of fingers there. To anyone else it seemed like business as usual. But in the quiet moments when they were alone, their love flourished. One evening, Joseph invited Ruth to his small apartment for dinner. It wasn't much, a cozy one-bedroom space with mismatched furniture and a faint smell of lavender from the candle he'd lit. "I know it's not as fancy as your place," Joseph said, setting 2 plates of pasta on the table. "Stop," Ruth interrupted, smiling. "It's perfect. It feels like you." They ate together, the simple meal filled with laughter and stories. Ruth told Joseph about her childhood on a farm, how she'd wake up before dawn to feed the chickens. Joseph shared tales of his teenage years, sneaking into the school gym after hours to practice lifting weights. As the night wore on, Ruth leaned back in her chair, her gaze soft. "You know, Joseph, I never thought I'd feel this way again. I thought that part of my life was over." Joseph reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You deserve to feel this way, Ruth. And I'm lucky to be the one to remind you." Ruth smiled, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "What happens when people find out? When they start talking?" "They'll talk," Joseph admitted. "But let them. People always have something to say. What matters is what we feel, not what they think." Ruth wanted to believe him, but years of living under society's expectations had left scars she couldn't ignore. The gossip started not long after. It wasn't surprising. Joseph was a well-known figure in town, and Ruth's presence at the gym had always drawn attention. But when they were spotted having lunch together at a small cafe, the whispers grew louder. "Did you hear about Joseph and that older woman? Isn't she like twice his age? That's just weird." The comments stung even though Ruth tried her best to ignore them. She avoided eye contact during her workouts and stopped lingering at the smoothie bar. Joseph noticed the change and confronted her one evening after everyone had left the gym. "Ruth," he said gently, blocking her path as she tried to leave. "What's going on?" She sighed, looking down at her feet. "They're talking, Joseph. Everyone is talking." "Let them talk," he said firmly. "They don't know us. They don't know what we've been through. But they judge anyway," Ruth whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "And I don't know if I'm strong enough to face it." Joseph cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "You are strong, Ruth. Stronger than anyone I know. Don't let them take that away from you." Ruth leaned into his touch, her heart aching with both love and fear. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the happiness they'd found together. But the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. One afternoon, while Ruth was at home tending to her garden, she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found her neighbor, Mrs. Ezekiel, standing on the porch with a basket of muffins. "I thought you might like these," Mrs. Ezekiel said, her smile warm but curious. "Thank you," Ruth replied, taking the basket. Mrs. Ezekiel lingered, her eyes searching Ruth's face. "You know, Ruth, people are talking about you and that young gym instructor." Ruth stiffened. "And what are they saying?" Mrs. Ezekiel hesitated. "Some people think it's inappropriate. But I don't. You've been through so much, and if he makes you happy, who cares what anyone else thinks?" Ruth blinked, surprised by the unexpected support. "Thank you, Mrs. Ezekiel. That means more than you know." As her neighbor walked away, Ruth felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe not everyone was against her and Joseph. Maybe some people understood. But the gossip wasn't the only challenge they faced. One night, as Joseph was locking up the gym, a group of men approached him. They were regulars at Suck It Up, and Joseph recognized them immediately. "Hey, Joseph," one of them said, his tone mocking. "So, is it true? You're dating that old lady?" Joseph's jaw tightened. "Her name is Ruth. And what I do with my personal life is none of your business." The men laughed, their voices filled with mockery. "Come on, man. You could have anyone you want. Why her?" Joseph stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "Because she's kind, strong, and more amazing than any of you could ever understand. Now, if you've got a problem with that, you can take it somewhere else." The men backed off, muttering under their breath, but Joseph knew the confrontation wouldn't be the last. Despite the challenges, Joseph and Ruth grew closer. They began spending more time together, ignoring the whispers and focusing on their bond. But Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that their happiness was fragile, that one wrong move could shatter everything. Her fears came to a head one evening when she was feeling feverish and a little nauseous, and she thought it was just a normal ailment. Upon going to the hospital for examination, she lost it when the doctor told her she was pregnant. It couldn't be. She hadn't even thought it was possible at her age. But as the days passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. Ruth was pregnant. Her first reaction was disbelief, followed by panic. How could this have happened? What would Joseph think? Would he leave her? Summoning all her courage, Ruth decided to tell him the truth. She invited him over one evening, her hands trembling as she prepared dinner. When Joseph arrived, he immediately sensed something was wrong. "Ruth," he said, sitting down at the table. "What's going on?" She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "Joseph, I'm pregnant." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then Joseph's face broke into a wide smile. "Ruth, that's amazing," he said, his voice filled with joy. Ruth stared at him, stunned. You're happy?" "Of course I'm happy," Joseph said, taking her hands in his. "We're going to be parents, Ruth. This is a blessing." Tears streamed down Ruth's face as Joseph pulled her into his arms. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could face the world together. And the news of Ruth's pregnancy spread through the town like wildfire. People gossiped, whispered behind cupped hands, and speculated about how a 60-year-old woman could possibly be expecting a child. Some dismissed it as a lie, while others cruelly suggested it was a desperate attempt to cling to youth. Ruth and Joseph, however, focused on each other and the life growing inside her. Despite the whispers, Joseph was overjoyed and stepped into his new role as a soon-to-be father with enthusiasm and love. He took over Ruth's errands, made sure she attended every doctor's appointment, and even read books on pregnancy and parenting. But for Ruth, the journey was more complicated. One morning, Ruth sat in the living room staring at the ultrasound picture in her hands. The tiny image of her baby brought a mix of emotions: joy, fear, and doubt. She couldn't help but wonder if she was too old for this, if she was putting her child at risk by having a baby at her age. Joseph walked in and saw the worry etched on her face. He sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. Ruth hesitated, then held up the picture. "Do you think I'm making a mistake? What if something goes wrong? What if I can't do this?" Joseph cupped her face in his hands, looking into her eyes. "Ruth, you're one of the strongest people I know. You've faced so much in your life and you've come out stronger every time. This baby is a gift, and I know you're going to be an amazing mother." Tears welled up in Ruth's eyes as she nodded, letting his words soothe her doubts. As Ruth's pregnancy progressed, Joseph became fiercely protective. He didn't care what people said about their relationship or the age difference anymore. All that mattered was Ruth and their child. But the judgment from others wasn't easy to ignore. One afternoon, while shopping for baby clothes, Ruth overheard two women whispering behind her in the store. "Can you believe she's having a baby at her age? It's ridiculous. She's just trying to relive her youth. It's selfish." Ruth's hands trembled as she placed a tiny onesie back on the rack. The words stung, and for a moment she wanted to leave the store and never come back. But then she thought of Joseph's unwavering support and the little life inside her. She squared her shoulders, picked up the onesie again, and headed to the register. When Joseph saw the bag of baby clothes later that evening, he smiled. "You're getting ready early," he teased. Ruth laughed softly. "I just wanted to do something for her." "Her?" Joseph asked, his eyes lighting up. Ruth nodded. "I have a feeling it's a girl." Joseph grinned. "Then she's already lucky, because she's going to have the best mom in the world." Months flew by and Ruth's belly grew rounder. Despite the challenges of a high-risk pregnancy, she remained determined. Joseph stayed by her side every step of the way, even decorating a nursery in her home with soft yellow walls and tiny stars painted on the ceiling. One evening, as they sat in the nursery assembling a crib, Ruth looked around the room and felt a deep sense of peace. "Joseph," she said softly, "I never thought I'd have this. A family. A chance to be a mother." Joseph placed a hand over hers. "And I never thought I'd find someone like you. Life has a funny way of surprising you, doesn't it?" Ruth smiled, her heart full. Late one night, Ruth woke up with a sharp pain in her stomach. Panic set in as she realized something was wrong. "Joseph," she called, her voice shaky. Joseph was by her side in seconds, his face pale with worry. "What's wrong? Is it the baby?" "I don't know," Ruth said, clutching her belly. "We need to go to the hospital." They rushed to the hospital, the drive filled with tense silence. Ruth tried to stay calm, but fear gripped her. What if something happened to the baby? What if this was the end of her dream? At the hospital, the doctors examined Ruth and reassured her that everything was fine. It was a false alarm, but they advised her to rest more and avoid stress. As they drove home, Joseph reached over and took her hand. "You scared me," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I scared myself," Ruth whispered. "But I'm okay. And so is she." Joseph smiled, squeezing her hand. "We'll get through this, Ruth. Together." Finally the day arrived. Ruth went into labor on a sunny morning, and Joseph stayed by her side through every contraction, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Hours later, their daughter was born. She was tiny, with a full head of dark hair and a strong, healthy cry. When the nurse placed the baby in Ruth's arms, she felt a rush of love so overwhelming that tears streamed down her face. "Joseph," she said, her voice trembling, "she's perfect." Joseph leaned down, his eyes filled with awe as he looked at their daughter. "She's beautiful," he said softly. They named her Joy, a testament to the happiness she had brought into their lives. In the weeks that followed, Ruth and Joseph adjusted to their new roles as parents. Ruth spent her days caring for Joy, while Joseph balanced his work at the gym with his duties as a father. The gossip in town didn't stop, but Ruth no longer cared. Every time she held Joy in her arms or saw Joseph, she knew she had made the right choice. Their little family wasn't conventional, but it was filled with love, and that was all that mattered. As Ruth sat in the rocking chair one evening watching Joy sleep, she thought about everything she had been through, the loss, the loneliness, the judgment, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. She looked over at Joseph, who was sitting on the floor playing with one of Joy's toys. "Thank you," she said softly. Joseph looked up, confused. "For what?" "For giving me a second chance at happiness. For being you." Joseph smiled, standing up and walking over to her. He kissed her forehead and said, "Thank you for letting me be a part of this. Of us."